Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. I'm Erica Chenoweth, and I'd like to welcome you all to the second in our TOPL webinar series. Today, we are lucky enough to hear from a number of activists who have been involved in a movement against authoritarianism in Nicaragua. This is part of an ongoing series of webinars in which the Nonviolent Action Lab at the Carr Center at Harvard University is trying to curate some conversations with activists from around the world about their struggles and successes so that we can collect knowledge about and wisdom about general principles regarding nonviolent resistance in the world. Before we get started with our panel, which I think is going to be really exciting and engaging, I first want to thank the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard Kennedy School, particularly the executive director, Sushma Raman, Jana Brown, Larissa de Silveira, and Alex Geller for putting on this event today. I'd also like to thank Sydney Topol and the Topol Family Foundation for supporting the Topol Fellowship that makes possible our student engagement in this series. I'd like to thank you all for tuning in and for the questions that you're going to be asking and the ways that you're going to be engaging with us today through the live chat. And I especially want to thank our panelists and today's co-host with me, who is Enrique Gastiazoro, who has convened today's conversation. Enrique is a recent graduate of Harvard Kennedy School, and he himself has had an impressive career in both journalism and organizing before coming to the Kennedy School as a student, and has convened today a really exciting panel of people who've had a range of experiences around resistance and movement building that I really look forward to hearing from and learning from. So Enrique, over to you.
Thank you, Erica. Hello, and thank you all for joining this conversation. My name is Enrique, I'm Nicaraguan, and I worked as general manager for Confidencial since 2017. Confidencial is one of Nicaragua's emblematic independent media outlets. Our newsroom has been occupied by the police since December 2018, but our journalism has carried on and grown with the support of the Nicaraguan public. Nicaragua is trapped in a succession of compounded crises. Daniel Ortega's violence against pensioners and student protests following a social security reform in April 2018 sparked a civil resistance campaign that demands democratic change and justice for state terror. Ortega's authoritarian corporatism, in which notable business leaders were complicit, collapsed. The regime transitioned to a brutal police state that is isolated within Nicaragua and internationally. Since 2018, the regime's paramilitary and police forces have killed more than 300 people, including 19 minors, imprisoned and tortured hundreds, forced 100,000 into exile, murdered, harassed, and attacked journalists, and shut down media outlets, among other atrocities, such as denying care to wounded protesters in public hospitals. Now, Nicaraguans are facing the worst of the global pandemic. Ortega is determined to make matters worse. Hospitals and the public health system are overrun. The state is failing to protect health workers and also criminalizing citizen attempts to gather and deliver support. It continues to promote cultural, political, and social activities. It spreads disinformation and propaganda portraying a fictional health system under normal circumstances. Doctors have been fired from public hospitals for providing protection equipment to their own colleagues, for speaking out against government inaction, and for collaborating with citizen monitoring efforts that counter restrictions on access to information. The Ortega regime has shown that it is willing and able to use state and para-state violence to hold on to power at all costs. It has also shown that it is unwilling and unable to face the COVID pandemic in Nicaragua and incapable of governing. This new crisis has reawakened collective action and solidarity as the protests did in 2018. Yet, the trajectory of people power in the face of Ortega's authoritarianism predates the April 2018 uprising. Today, as Erica mentioned, we are grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation with a group of Nicaraguans who can help us understand people power in Nicaragua in a context of democratic decay and decreasing civic space, since the return of Ortega to power in 2007. Mónica López is an environmentalist and human rights defender. As an ally and advisor with the campesino movement that emerged to face the Interoceanic Canal megaproject in 2013, she has a unique perspective on how the movement managed to expand civic space and show the potential of people power at massive scale in Nicaragua for the first time since Ortega's return to power. Amaya Coppens is a medical student, student activist, and political prisoner. She has been incarcerated twice by the Ortega regime, spending up to nearly 300 days in prison unjustly. During her first incarceration, she rejected preferential treatment on account of her dual Belgian citizenship. And the second time she was arbitrarily in prison, her alleged crime was bringing water to family members of other political prisoners who were under siege by the police inside a church where they had gathered for a hunger strike. Her conviction and courage have inspired countless Nicaraguans. Mateo Jarquin is a scholar who explores the links between 20th century revolutions in the so-called Global South and ensuing debates on development, democratization, and international relations. He is part of a new generation of scholars who must play a crucial role in helping Nicaraguans learn from the past to better face the present and the future. This is crucial in a country historically marked by impunity and oblivion. Thank you all for being here and for your work. Before we move on, I would like to take a moment to remember the victims of Ortega's brutality and of his incapacity to govern in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. In that spirit, allow me to share with you the story of Álvaro Conrado. Álvaro was 15 years old when he was murdered on April 20th, 2018 for bringing water to protesters at the National University of Engineering. He was the first miner who was murdered in the context of the uprising. A day earlier, he had asked his father to explain to him what the protests were about. And despite his father's warnings to the contrary, but true to the principles of the Jesuit high school where he was in the 10th grade, Álvaro joined what he considered a just cause. For doing so, he met with a bullet to the neck. The bullet did not kill him instantly, but the first hospital where he was taken refused to treat him as a reprisal for his opposition to the government. He eventually died from bleeding. Álvaro's words upon being shot will be forever etched in the minds of Nicaraguans and may seem tragically familiar to many of you in the United States. He repeated, "It hurts to breathe." Álvaro Conrado, presente. So now I would like to move on to our first segment and with a question for Amaya. Amaya, would you share with us what changed for students and for student activism in Nicaragua in April of 2018? When did you all realize that your protest as medical students in the public university in León had actually helped start a national nonviolent uprising?
Well, first of all, thank you all for organizing this and for taking us into account. I think, well, first of all, it's important to say that it all did not start in 2018. There were protests that had been going on from way before, and really 2018 was rather a response to an accumulation of several aggressions to our country and to our people in general. As a matter of fact, the first political prisoner in Nicaragua, Marvin Vargas, dates back to 2011, and he is still in prison at this moment after 9 years of arbitrary detention. And well, this government really used political clientelism to buy political support from people in every sector of the population, including, and the same happened in public universities, where you actually had to be able to get the scholarship, to be able to live on the university campus, you had to show your loyalty to the regime. And we sort of made jokes about it, but there were actually lists that were taken in all of the activities that the regime would do, including, by the way, for example, a parade to say that the students of Unan Leon were supporting the construction of the canal, and without even telling students that it was going to be that would be the name of the parade, you know. So, but in 2018, the requirements to for this sort of guest as the regime sort of put it, the requirements grew bigger and bigger, and at that moment, it required from the students to actually become paramilitaries, and to in a way it was to fake that all of these aggressions to the first people protesting was a spontaneous and natural reaction from the people to defend and to stand up for this political party, which yeah, so at that moment I feel that there was a rupture with this situation, because it actually implied for the students to go on the street and beat up the first people protesting, which in Leon were old people protesting for the pensions. And you could actually see student representatives, like, for example, Walter Malta, who had been in the university for as long as I can know, that were people that actually got paid, that actually got a salary and changed their career again and again, because actually their job was to be in the university and to keep an eye on the students. And so we could see that image of him as a student representative beating up an old person in the streets, and that image just spread out. You know, it was not possible after that to go back to normality. We could not just pretend that we had not seen what had happened. And I think, you know, nobody was really aware of the magnitude of what was happening at the moment. We just felt the urge of going out, of rejecting the normality, rejecting a routine, because it was not possible for us to go back to normal as if nothing had happened. And in our cases as medical students, you know, after we saw the Ministry of Health closing the gates of the hospital, we just, how are you going to go back there, you know? So I think it just marked a rupture in this sort of agreements that many people had to do, many students that are not, and that were not as privileged as many, and that needed that government funds to be able to attend the universities. So I feel that it just, at that point, there was just a rupture, because, and in our cases, it was going completely against our Hippocratic oath. So, you know, it was just going against all of our principles. So I think that marked a beginning in all of this.
Thank you, Amaya. Amaya mentioned how the Ortega regime tried to use public university students, even during the times of when the campesino movement against the canal project rose. So that's a good segue for us to shift over to Monica and to ask you, Monica, how did the campesino movement that emerged in 2013 against the Interoceanic Canal project change the situation of people power in Nicaragua? And what role did it play later on during April 2018?
Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to this conversation. And thank you very much, Enrique, for starting up, reminding us, reminding us all the victims and Alvarito Conrado, most of all. Well, I think that to calibrate the impact of the anti-canal movement, it's necessary to take into account some historical circumstances. For several centuries, the traditional political forces and groups of power in Nicaragua cultivated in the imagination of Nicaraguan people the myth that the construction of an interoceanic canal would magically make us emerge from poverty, and that it would bring stability and progress for all in Nicaragua. So when Ortega announced the canal concession and the initial construction of the works, I think Ortega was also thinking that this mega project would put some sort of final seal on his perpetual stay in power, along with his alliance, as you mentioned, with big corporations and the control over union leadership. Ortega had also ended all kind of social mobilization as part of their stability pact. So the anti-canal movement, which was integrated in a broad sense by the campesinos movement, environmentalists, academics, feminists, human rights defenders, and also independent media, all together confronted the political fantasy of the canal, disarticulating the regime's main perpetuation project. But it was the campesinos movement itself that challenged Ortega control over the streets, organized from the ground, from rural communities, and mobilizing with their own resources. In just few years, the campesinos movement emerged as a new, potent, autonomous force beyond the regime's control, beyond the pacts with the political elites and political parties, and also the alliance with the corporations. So I think progressively, the campesinos movement addressed the entire country, denouncing the canal concession as a complete loss of sovereignty, and also a catastrophic inheritance for future generations, organizing almost 100 marches, some of them in the capital, in Managua. In this way, they were building bridges with urban sectors, including students like Amaya was mentioning. So when the citizens' insurrection of April 2018 occurred, people, of course, naturally look at the campesinos movement as an example. I think the movement, one of the important elements of the movement is that the land of protest was fertilized by the campesinos movement. And also at this time in April 2018, the myth of the canal was gone, and Nicaragua people were rebelled all over the country against the repression of the regime and also claiming Ortega to leave power. So I think at this point of the history, the dictatorship was, I think, on the edge of the precipice.
Thank you, Monica. Amaya or Mateo, would you maybe like to complement, because I certainly remember anecdotally how encouraging it was during April of 2018 to know that the campesinos were moving from their territories to the capital city, or to be protesting peacefully on the streets side by side with them. I remember feeling, this is a group that has been doing this for years, and feeling a lot safer, feeling very encouraged. And I remember talking to a lot of people who had not protested against this government ever before, but who also kind of shared that enthusiasm of feeling that they were backed up with the support and solidarity of the campesino movement. So Amaya and Mateo, would you maybe like to speak to that before we move on?
Oh, yeah, I think, it was, for us, this campesino movement really represented, the moral power, of resistance. And it really, for me, I feel that, the anti-canal movement, as well as, for example, the feminist movement, set the basis of civil resistance in Nicaragua. And they started, they set they started organizing from way before, even before the rest of us actually got aware of that this government did not allow for any criticism on the way that they were doing politics. So really, I felt that at that point, we knew how many things had been done from the campesino movement. And I feel, we felt this felt this, in a way, culpability of not being there before, not realizing before, and at that moment, there were these images of the campesino movement moving in trucks to the capital at one point, that they were attacking students in the university. And, it just, you saw these images and you imagine these people that had, in a monetary sense, way less than a lot of us, and that were there and that did not think about it, but just jumped on trucks and went on to the capital. For us, it was just, yeah, I don't know, it just felt so empowering at that moment, and we felt that really there was a lot of people behind of us. We felt more secure in a way.
Thank you, Amaya. Mateo, let's tap into your historical perspective. Could you please describe to us how collective action in Nicaragua has evolved from the armed Sandinista revolution of decades ago to the civil resistance campaign of April 2018?
Of course. And first of all, thank you, Erica and Enrique. It's an honor truly to be here with Monica and Amaya. So on the one hand, collective action in 2018 was very different from 1979 and the armed revolution that many people at the Carr Center will be familiar with. Today, protesters renounce violence. And what's more, they articulate nonviolence as the key to building lasting change after Ortega is gone. So obviously quite distinct to an armed revolution. And their movement is also different in that it isn't motivated by ideology. In 1979 and across the global South in that period, ideologies of socialism and national liberation justified armed revolution and violence against oppressors. Today, for better or worse, there is no unifying ideology or program. It's a very diverse movement. But then again, there are some similarities worth taking into account. So consider the modalities of protest. The barricades and roadblocks that protesters erected strongly evoked the imagery of 1979. And many of the war slogans and chants you heard in 2018 were clearly borrowed from that earlier struggle, which was also against a dynastic dictatorship like the one that we have today. And finally, many student leaders and leaders in civil society come from Sandinista backgrounds. And from that perspective, you might see their struggle as a sort of response to the unfulfilled promises of earlier instances of collective action. But ultimately, I think that we should recognize that the international context for collective action is so different in 2018 that it's hard to make comparisons. In 1979, there was an armed revolution against Somoza, largely because the Sandinista front received arms and funding from Cuba, Venezuela, Panama, and armed movements across the continent. In the 1980s, there was an armed rebellion against the Sandinista government, largely because the United States trained and organized an insurgency, which later became known as the Contra. So that Cold War context of foreign interventions and transnational revolutions is gone.
Great, thank you, Mateo. So taking that into account, which obstacles would you say had to be overcome for this massive civil resistance campaign to be able to materialize in Nicaragua in 2018? And can it mark a turning point from the recurring episodes of violence in Nicaraguan history?
Well, I think that Amaya really hit the nail on the head earlier, and I'll explain why in a second. Since returning to power in 2007, Daniel Ortega consolidated an authoritarian regime with blatantly dynastic aspirations, which from the outside at least looked very stable, especially in the context of Central America. And then 2018 happened. So how did we get there all of a sudden? Well, when we ponder these cases of authoritarian consolidation, I think it's helpful to think in terms of bargains. And what I mean by that is that dictators offer something to their populations in return for their collaboration or quiescence in concentrating power. And in the Nicaraguan case, such a bargain was very evident at the elite level. Daniel Ortega, a former Marxist rebel, promised his former foes in the capitalist class that he would abandon any socialist redistributive project and instead embrace neoliberal market-based orthodoxy. In other words, give me power and I'll give you stable conditions for investment and growth. And in the case of his former enemies in the Catholic Church, he turned the formerly left-wing Sandinista front into a Christian, socially conservative movement, and as an act of faith, he helped criminalize abortion in the country. These elite actors did not just turn a blind eye to the erosion of democratic institutions. They were actively complicit on occasion in the silencing of dissent because they came to see criticism of the regime as a threat to their own corporatist compact that they had built. But I think that what Amaya shed light on was that this bargain of authoritarian stability in return for unquestioned political power also operated more widely in every sector of society. And to understand why, you have to get a sense of the context. In the 1970s, there was a devastating war to oust a brutal dictator, which was followed in the 1980s by revolutionary upheaval, foreign intervention, and another war. The transition to democracy in 1990 put an end to armed conflict, but the country was wrecked. And therefore, the benefits of peaceful elections were not accompanied by a sense of social or economic well-being for most Nicaraguans. The ground was fertile for a would-be dictator to come along and offer stability, economic growth, and traditionalist values at the price of democratic norms and institutions. And in doing so, Ortega really replicated the authoritarian bargain offered by the Somoza dynasty in the 20th century, which, by the way, lasted for 4 decades. And so again, I think that Amaya was right when she was talking about these sorts of agreements. I think that this bargain was the biggest obstacle to civil resistance because it had such an ingrained systemic effect. And I think that what happened in 2018 was that the bargain expired. By responding to even small protests by environmentalists, by the rural farmers associations, with lethal force, filling the streets with blood, the Ortega family proved that they were incapable of providing the stability they had promised. It had been a Faustian bargain.
Thank you, Mateo. Let's move on to Monica. And Monica, maybe we can get a little bit more into the how, or even into some of the tactics here. But could you share with us how the campesino movement managed to overcome ideological division, much of which dated to the troubled periods that Mateo just referenced, in order to build an inclusive and massive nonviolent movement in 2013? And as a second part to the question, what can other social movements and actors learn from the challenges that the campesino movement is facing regarding the right balance between civil resistance, or the outside game, and traditional political mechanisms such as elections, the inside game?
Well, I think that it's important to recognize that the prelude of the campesinos movement required a lot of very consistent small work. I don't know how to say it in English. In Spanish, we say it trabajo de hormiga. I don't know if ant work exists in English, but the first year after the approval of the canal concession, civil societies organizations gathered in different groups, but in our case, Grupo Cocibolca, in which Popolná, my own organization, is part of, and by the way, also occupied by the police in 2018, we decided to organize several local forums in different rural communities along the projected canal route. Side by side with the campesinos leaders from those communities, we traveled and visited all of these places, explaining all the time the deep implications and consequences of the canal law to their livelihoods, the impact on water resources, the human rights violations that were related to it, and so on. So I think the conscious appropriation of this knowledge and the reality of the damage that the regime's decisions were making in their own lives led these local leaders to call to their own local meetings, pushing through this awareness, the organization of the campesinos movement bit by bit. And from that process, new leaders arose from different backgrounds. They started joining forces aiming at one same purpose, which was the derogation of the canal concession. I think the threat was so massive that it was almost an imperative to put ideological difference aside to achieve the goal. But I also think that in this matter, women leaders such as Francisca Ramirez, I think they played a strategic conciliatory role because they also guided the movement to stay in the non-violent track. And to be honest, I think it's important to remember that in these communities, the memories of the war during the 80s, the menace of the expropriation were very present at the moment the anti-canal movement was being built. But the necessity of gathering was so high that you could see, for example, that someone like me, the daughter of a Sandinistas guerrilla commander, also with the same name of this person, by the way, could meet in a faraway community like Punta Gorda with a former Contra leader and sit at the same table to discuss a human rights agenda. I think, at least in my experience, those were the most inspiring moments. I think we could feel that we were maybe in the middle of something that could shift the historical polarization of the country. Of course, in the present context, you could argue that the movement might have given several steps backwards because of the historical prejudice that are still ingrained. But I think that the challenge and the possibility to change this matter is still there. And also, I think that the movement faced several political challenges posed mostly by the electoral agenda. I remember the long discussions with regards to the promotion or not of the participation in the fraudulent presidential elections in 2016 or the municipal elections in 2017. And I think that this is a subject where the campesinos movement, the same movement, followed two different paths. One was continuing as an autonomous social movement, and the other one was engaging in alliances with political parties. And in this definition process is still in 2020 a challenge for the movement. In my opinion, of course, I'm more closer to the proposal of constructing the social movements without necessarily giving out the agenda to political parties. But in the last part of this, I think the challenge is that this path of the campesinos movement has to be democratically defined within the movement, because when the campesinos leaders at the top get too far away from consulting with their communities, the risk of becoming just a new undemocratic cupola, it's very high. And it puts at risk all the immense credibility built so far by the movement. And I think the challenge is there.
Thank you, Monica. I would just like to add to that this is a microcosm of the same challenge that society as a whole is facing right now. where there's definitely a big challenge in terms of finding the right balance between the need for external, outside of established institutions, kind of people power pressure, and then at the same time to prepare maybe to use any kind of electoral opening as a meeting point, as an opportunity. But there's also a very strong narrative of elections in and of themselves are a solution. And I think that's something that needs to be questioned much more broadly. Thank you, Monica. In order to wrap up this segment of our conversation, I would like to ask Amaya, what have you learned as a student activist and political prisoner that should be engraved in Nicaragua's history and in our collective mindset going forward?
Thank you. I think one of the most important things to learn from all of the situation that we've gotten into in Nicaragua, and that doesn't, as I said, doesn't really just started in 2018. I think the most important part is that we cannot give a blank card to absolutely anyone. I mean, we felt at some point there was, as Mateo said, there was such a relief of getting out of an authoritarian regime that we sort of trusted people that were in power. So I felt that, yeah, that's the most important part of it. I think that 2018 was a moment when everyone just got involved, you know, like everyone was aware of what was happening, and we felt the urge of knowing what was happening, of being included in the situation and of saying what we thought was wrong at the moment, even people that were not involved before in the political life in Nicaragua. And I think that needs to be included in our normal routine, even if we don't work in politics. We need to be aware of what's going on. The political life in Nicaragua needs to stop being an affair of just the elite of the Nicaraguan population. I mean, we could see during all of these state powers, all of the state institutions were completely colluded and deeply involved in the human rights violation and the crimes against humanity that took place and that are still taking place in Nicaragua at this right moment. For example, we had the Ministry of Health closing down the doors of the hospitals. You had the Ministry of Education, you had the universities expelling students that would say what is wrong with the government, that would actually give away all of the private information from the students that participated in the protest, including their address, including the phone numbers, their family members, and absolutely all of the information that they had about the students. And for example, as well, the judiciary system that based many trials on lies that became even ridiculous at some point. And with that, I want to pinpoint, for example, a case that is happening right now. Marvin Antonio Rodriguez just had his initial audience on Wednesday this week, and he was accused of a crime that occurred the 23rd, while he is actually in jail since the 22nd. And that's just an example of how ridiculous the cases that they created were. And it is this same judiciary system that completely lost all of its credibility, that still retains in prison, as it is of right now, 97 political prisoners. So I think, you know, in all of these people in completely unhuman conditions that only come to be worsened by the pandemic that we were suffering in the world right now. And, I think this sort of shows you how deeply, how this government just got so deep into the society that we realized in 2018 and in these 2 years that we have been living that they closed the grip on the population, and we actually see how colluded it is. So I think not allowing that is one of the main purposes that we have as citizens in Nicaragua right now. No allowing ever again that any government has the power to do whatever they want to do as this government did. So I think to build a culture of accountability in Nicaragua is one of the main goals that we need to have as Nicaraguans.
Thank you, Amaya. And what I'm hearing you say really echoes a lot, because basically what I feel it is in the same way that change in general needs to be independent from crisis. We often depend on crisis for change. I also think that there's an underlying lesson there in terms of people power, not as something that we turn to in the last instance when the grip is closed, but of something that we practice every day in order to build high energy democracies from the start. So that's very, very valuable. So here I'll pass the mic over to Erica, who's going to lead us in the next segment.
Great, thank you so much. We have some questions from the audience that we will shortly get to. Before we do that, I just wanted to ask one question, if possible, about the sort of state of affairs right now. Amaya kind of alluded to the recent events surrounding the pandemic and the way that that's impacting civil society and people power in Nicaragua right now. But before we move to audience questions, can you just sort of maybe help us understand the state of the movement now, the 2018 movement in particular? Where do things stand with regard to successes and failures from that time? And maybe we can start with Mateo, and then Amaya, and then Monica, if there's anything left to say.
Sure. So related to your question earlier, Enrique asked if this massive civil resistance movement of 2018 can be a turning point in this sort of recurring episodes of violence in Nicaragua, where we have very little experience with peaceful transfers of power, unfortunately. And I'd like to think that it's a turning point. Erica, your research and the literature on civil resistance shows that nonviolent movements are successful when they accomplish two things. One, when they raise the costs of repression, and two, when they encourage sectors of society, especially the armed forces, to turn on the regime. So what happened in the Nicaraguan case? Number one, massive resistance really did raise the cost of repression tremendously. But the regime proved able to absorb those costs. So before 2018, repression was relatively low cost, fairly selective, fairly limited, and tacitly supported by elite allies. But when suddenly you have tens of thousands of people on the streets, the repression has to become widespread, systematic, and very violent. And that created a lot of costs for the Ortega regime. It doomed their alliance with certain sectors of the elite. It ruined the economy. And of course, it invited international condemnation. But again, they proved able to absorb those costs. Number two, the military didn't turn on the regime. And this is where I think the Nicaraguan case is truly unique. And I don't know, Erica or Enrique, if you can think of a case that played out so similarly. But what happened in Nicaragua was that the military didn't actively participate in the repression, but they acquiesced to the government's use of the police and creation of paramilitary forces to launch militarized operations to clean up street protests. And so Ortega unlike most authoritarian rulers faced with a massive street challenge, was able to use state terror and violence with relatively few restrictions, even though the military stayed in the barracks. And so I think that the future of people power, it still depends on this X factor, which is the armed forces. The future of people power will still be determined to some extent by guns, who has them, and when violence is either used or threatened.
Great. Amaya.
Yes, thank you. Related to that, I would, what Mateo said, I would like to add to that, that even though the military stayed in the barracks, many of the armament that was used, and actually this is documented, many of the armament that was used to repress the protests is armament that only the military forces had. So even if they didn't show their faces publicly, but we know that they were involved and that they were also a part of the repression. You know, in a sense, I feel that they have just been keeping the image to minimize the reactions of the international governments against these particular groups. But I feel, talking about how the reality right now is in Nicaragua, it is necessary to say that we've had many impacts to the forces of the protests in Nicaragua, because as it is of today, we have more than 100,000 people that were forced into exile to keep themselves in security, to not be sent to jail or being killed, in the words of scenarios. So I feel that it is really important to say that we're not in the same situation that we were in 2018. And as well, the situation of the pandemic is only worsening the situation, not only in jails where we have more than 50% of the political prisoners that are presenting COVID-related symptoms, but in the society in general, because we've had many people being fired during this pandemic. We've had many people that live on the day-to-day basis that are not able to actually sustain themselves. And even, for example, we've had now repression occurring to even the medical system. I mean, anything, and this is really important to say, that any person that would contradict the speech of the government will be seen as a traitor to the government, and they will be taking away all of this gifts that we have been talking about during this whole conversation. Like, for example, right now, and just this week, we had a list of more than 12 doctors that were fired because they would talk about the reality that is being lived in the hospitals, and that goes against the white book that the government presented as the reality in Nicaragua. So I feel, it is really hard to keep on with the resistance when you see that the whole system is colluded. So it is one of the main obstacles that we've had. But we're seeing right now when even the people from their bases, the people that supported them, even if they saw the killings in the streets in 2018, are the ones that are still being sent to the streets to parade, to say that everything is normal and that COVID is not real, and so on. But they're starting to realize in the harsh way that the reality is another one, and it's not what the government is showing in Nicaragua and outside.
Very good. Monica, do you have anything to add?
Well, with regards to the opposition and the regime, I think both are at a crossroads right now. I think the opposition organizations that were born during the 2018 uprising now have the challenge to form a strong coalition among themselves, which doesn't seem to be an easy task to do. We have proven, I think, that we are able to unite in the protest in the streets. But now that the regime's violence has destroyed our mobilization capacity through death, jail, and exile, I think it has been utterly hard to unite in a common strategy. The main problem is not just the diversity of sectors within the opposition to the regime, groups with completely different ideological views, different origins, different interests. But I think that the core of the mistrust among ourselves is the view that some have tried to push further the struggle and risk all they had, including life, integrity, and even prison time. And some have slow-paced the struggle, especially the big private sector, trying to protect their economic interest as a priority. So right now, we don't seem to have a common strategy to defeat the regime, and the regime sees this as one of his strengths, unfortunately.
Yeah, so that actually is a great segue into some of the audience questions. We've had a number coming in, and since we're just on this topic, Monica, can you elaborate just a little bit about what you foresee might happen during the presidential elections next year, given the state of the opposition?
I think you have given me the most difficult question. It's really uncertain. It's really uncertain. As I said, there is a very strong discussion within the opposition in terms that quite evidently we are in the face of a dictatorship. We are in face of a regime responsible for crimes against the humanity. We are seeing the impact of the pandemic of the coronavirus pandemic will be. I cannot imagine how devastating, because of what we are seeing right now. It's completely horrifying. And we are not so sure what would be the state of the population along with the economical crisis that it's getting stronger within the months. I do think there is a strong idea that we should not accept to be engaged in an electoral process that does not give conditions to respect Nicaraguans people's vote. And this is, I think, one of the biggest things we need to defend at this moment. Conditions that we are pushing, at least as social movements, are quite basic. It's nothing out of the our imagination. Of course, we are claiming that it's impossible to go to an electoral process with political prisoners in jail. It's impossible to go to an electoral process if you can't go outside the street with a Nicaraguan flag without being arrested at the end of the day. How can you make a political campaign with those conditions when every time you go outside, you feel your life is in risk, and it's really at risk? And of course, we cannot go to elections with the same electoral system that has put over and over Ortega and their people in power, not caring at all about what Nicaraguan population says, what evidently the international community is saying about those electoral process not being credible at all. So at least from the social movement perspective, we are pushing very hard to have a common agreement between the opposition not to engage in those processes in those terms. We are not saying we are against an electoral process. It's quite obviously that we would be interested in engaging in a process that has the conditions that are required to respect people's will. But at this moment, at this day, we don't see those conditions for a 2021 process. And of course, it's a completely difficult situation, because at the same time, you see that this is exactly what the regimes wants, that we don't have the power to change the electoral process in 2021, and at the end do the same thing he has been doing for the past 10 years. So it's a very complex situation. I unfortunately, I wish I could say what would be the end point of this, but it's an internal struggle within the opposition also. And of course, one of our main fears, and this is completely, to be completely honest, is we do fear that some of the sectors that were along with Ortega for more than 10 years go back to that agreement. So it's quite complex too. At the same time that we are very critical to the big private sector because of their history, because of how they have defended their economical interests beyond the people's agenda, also try not to make them go back to the regime, because as Mateo said, we come from a history where a dictatorship can last 40 years in power. And I'm pretty scared, to be honest, that if we don't manage this with intelligence, we could be in the face of a new dynasty, and we wouldn't know. We cannot last under this situation 4 or 5 more years. It's unsustainable for us. So quite really, it's in the opposition side to have the intelligence and the political maturity to do what it takes to be in this situation.
Excellent, thank you. Mateo, earlier you were talking about the transnational dimensions of revolution and rebellion that were present throughout Central and Latin America during the 60s and 70s. And then, of course, the role of the United States and other actors in supporting counter-revolution and kind of right-wing forces in this instance. I was curious, one of the audience members has posted a question about the role of people who have been placed in exile as a result of the movement and the government's reaction to it. Can you talk a little bit about the role of Nicaraguans living outside of the country in a movement like this at this point?
They are a sine qua non of real elections. Monica captured very well the dilemma that we face, right? Is that we're a year and a half away from elections. Right now, there are no conditions. It's a police state, to put it bluntly. But at the same time, the civic struggle and a democratic struggle is the only viable option domestically, and is the only thing that the international community is going to go for. So just to add a couple of things to what Monica said that touches upon what you asked. One, we need unity, right? That's the core. The opposition movement needs to be on the same page about either participating or not participating, right? And then number two, to add to some of the conditions that Monica was talking about. It would be frankly absurd to have elections without first having full guarantees for the return of all exiles. Also, in 1990, the Sandinista revolution ended after free elections in which the rules of the game were very clearly established between the Sandinista government, the opposition, and the international community. The return of exiles was a key part of that. Freedom for all political prisoners was a big part of that. And I'll add one thing that people in Nicaragua are not talking about enough today. Of the many things we should not accept, one of them is we should not accept elections in which there isn't freedom of participation for all political parties and movements. Right now, we're in a situation where a select few political parties participated in the power sharing agreements, and so they are legally constituted and they can participate in elections. It's frankly ridiculous and ludicrous to think that that would be reasonably free and fair and competitive elections. We should not go for that.
Thank you. Amaya, one of the questions that that Enrique and I have been looking over regards how a person manages fear in the context of extreme repression, and how a movement can collectively prepare its participants to walk through or overcome fear. And we were hoping you might be able to reflect just a little bit on that question.
Okay, well, thank you. First of all, I would like to add as well a bit to the last question. I feel that and that in 2018 it wasn't just a response to the regime, but I feel that it was really a response to the whole traditional way of doing politics that we had in Nicaragua, that included not only the regime, but also all of the different actors that allowed the situation to actually get to what it was in 2018 and it is right now. So I feel that, that whole traditional way of doing politics really lost its credibility and also the different actors. So I feel that that is one of the main obstacles as well, because the population in general does not trust whatever was before 2018, not only the regime. And I feel as well that that is one of the main problems that we have, is that politics was based in trust, and it should not be based on trust. It should be based on accountability. And that is one of the main obstacles that we have, because we don't have the conditions to actually talk, to actually say that we have that in Nicaragua, and any elections that we would have in these conditions are not elections that would actually have any credibility. I feel, responding to the subject of the fear, I feel that at some point, as I said, it was a lot of spontaneous reaction. We just needed to say what was wrong. We needed to be there. And I feel that that is the main reason why so many people got involved, from different sectors. And you had a wide variety, like a wide range of people just in the streets with you. You had people from the markets, you had students, you had doctors, you had lawyers, you had, people that had never been involved in that. And just that feeling of being there in the streets with other people just claiming for the same thing just sort of did not make us think in fear. Just I feel for a long while before 2018 there was a lot of passivity in the country in general. There were many things, as I said before, that we just joked about to sort of brush it off from the reality that we had. But there were these things that were actually bothering us, but we just did not feel empowered enough to say that it was actually wrong. We just joked about it. But in 2018, you saw around and you could see how everyone was aware as well, awake in a sense. So I feel that, just that solidarity as well was a huge part of it, to know that many people were there and that were and that were even thinking of just giving everything that they had to the cause was a big part of it. You felt that you had to do the same as well. So as I said, even the less privileged people that really dependent on the funds from the government were there in the streets. So what about the rest of us, So in a sense, there in the same situation that you are in.
Erica, if I may just really quickly, because this question about fear, what motivated me to also try to bring this is because there's an anecdote about the second time that Amaya was being illegitimately arrested, where she basically is mocking the police officers because they're so blatantly planting evidence in front of these more than 12 activists who are bringing water to people. And I just want to bring that in, like the role that humor can play. And I've never spoken to Amaya about this before, but I remember from reading it way back then, just how much that could be an example in terms of if I ever found myself in that kind of situation, I hope that I could turn to humor as a way to also maybe help my peers who are in that situation, many of whom had not been through this experience before. So I wanted to bring that in as well.
It's a very helpful intervention, Enrique. And I think, it's remarkable when Amaya was sharing her experience just then, how common what she said seems to be across so many movements around the world, that there really is genuine power in numbers and genuine power in the experience of solidarity and witness. And Enrique, as you said, just kind of spontaneous moments of creativity, humor, skill that seem to be available to many people who have been involved in struggle for a long time. So we're running a bit short on time. I think we'll take one more of the audience questions, and then we'll do a round of final comments from everyone. So Amaya mentioned a couple of times this hope that a culture of accountability would emerge in Nicaragua. And one of the questions from the audience regards accountability for crimes committed during the regime. So when Ortega is gone, what are the sort of ideas available for how to create accountability for those who are responsible for the torture, wrongful imprisonment, assassination, expulsion of political opponents? And what are the ideas available, and kind of where are they in the process? Maybe Monica can start on this one.
Yeah, I think with regards to justice, which is also very relevant to say that it's also one of the important agenda social movements are pushing throughout opposition, which is that we cannot go again through a transition without justice. Of course, there is a strong strategy, I think, that it's being built by the Association of Mothers of April, Madres de Abril, AMA. Of course, we have a huge lack in legal terms that we have not signed the Statute of Rome, and this means that all of the crimes against humanity right now under our international legislation could not be covered. But of course, that is one of the main things that in transition has to be signed. And I think that there is a group of people doing a very important job, which is reconstruction of the events, compiling the information for the cases. This is a very slow-moving process, very complex, but I think for the first time it's being done in Nicaragua. And of course, we always have people in the opposition that are thinking that the transition requires impunity, and this is very common in our history. But I think that new generations are pushing very strongly for the justice agenda. I have my hopes that we will win this part of the discussion. But also, I wanted to add with regards a little bit to what you were asking, it's interesting to see that one of the slogans in the protest that recalled, as Mateo said, the ones that happened in the 70s in the struggle against Somocistas dictatorship, was that people on the street said, patria libre para vivir. This means we want a free country to live, not like in the 70s, we want a free country or we die. It's a huge shift, because we are putting, and this reminds me of the podcast that Enrique sent me, that putting life at the center of our struggle, protecting life. We don't want any new martyrs. We don't want to compile an amount of people dying for the promise of a transformation strong in the society. We want to go step by step. And I think that one important fact that we need to get into the core of the social movements and the opposition movements right now is that we will have an enormous social change agenda during the transition and after the transition. This is right now not the revolution of all of our dreams. This is the moment to push for a transition without armed confrontation and without more losses of lives. And if we engage with this idea, and if we build the alliances we need, internal alliances we need to build, I think we will see at the end that what we are doing is not giving away our social agendas, but actually giving the space for them to become alive in the transition and in the future. Because right now we are on the verge of a dictatorship that is willing to kill every independent voice in this country and to incarcerate and to keep sending into the exile. So what change can come to Nicaragua from that? So I think that we need to engage with the idea that this is a process. It has its peaks. We cannot achieve everything we want in one single strike. But of course, we need to have the civic society space to keep building on all of the dreams that were on the streets when we were protesting in April.
You've all shared such amazing insights, experience, and reflections about civil resistance in Nicaragua today. And what I'd like us to close on is just a quick round, starting with Monica, then Mateo, then Amaya, and then Enrique. If there was one key takeaway from your experience, your insights, or your reflections on civil resistance that you think could apply to other movements around the world, whether they're struggling against authoritarianism, whether they're struggling against systemic racism, as is happening in the US today, whether they're struggling against inequality or other types of oppressions, what is your one message that you might make to others struggling using nonviolent resistance today?
Well, I would have to say that it is absolutely true that racism, inequality, authoritarianism is not letting us breathe. But it's also important to be clear that building these democratic, inclusive societies implies transformation processes that cannot be achieved by unique acts like the 2018 rebellion in Nicaragua or what's going on right now in the United States. And in the end, I think all of this that is going on worldwide, it's the expression of several crises that are indicating that we need a shift worldwide. And I think that it's also showing that humanity has a shared dream, that we are longing for change, that we need to make our societies, we need to make possible in our societies, as Zapatista said, that many worlds fit in the same world. And I think the only way is solidarity, collaboration, learning, and working together.
I would say, I think that's said many times in this conversation. I feel that we need to realize that everything that we do has an impact. And I mean, everything adds up in a way. It's a lot of individual actions that put together a collective force as the insurrection in 2018 and so on. So I feel that the most important thing that we need to be aware of is the weight that our own voice has in what we're living, and that we need to speak up if we see something wrong. We cannot just wait for someone else to say it and to stand behind. We need to be there and speak up if we see something wrong.
My message is for Nicaragua mostly, and it's that we should never forget April of 2018. Never forget the victims of state terror. never forget the people who continue to be held prisoner and continue to suffer harassment for their political views, but also to never forget the spirit of April of 2018, when we felt that our best days were yet to come, when we really felt like we could rebuild and reimagine the country and even be an example to the world. It was a moment of indescribable beauty, when it didn't matter if you were a business owner or a civil servant, a churchgoer or a feminist. It didn't matter if you were a liberal or a conservative or a Sandinista. Everybody was united by a shared aspiration for something better. And the regime can never take that away from us. They can never take away what we built those days. And the future will depend on our ability to appeal to all Nicaraguans, on our ability to remake the spirit of April 2018.
Oh, I guess my message to start with would be to sign on to Monica, Amaya's, and Mateo's messages. But in a very simple way, I mean, these are not her exact words, but I got goosebumps in last week's Topo webinar when my friend and accomplice, Nico, from Hungary mentioned, well, wherever you are, if you're standing up to fight against injustice, you know, you should know that you won't be alone, that people will be there. People will stand up with you. And that was really powerful for me to hear her say that then. And I think that it's an important message, whether it's for people in the United States right now or in any other countries, and whether we're talking about specific regimes or we're talking about structural issues such as racism and inequality.
Well, thanks so much to all of you. Thanks to those of us, those folks who have been joining us live on YouTube, and to the Carr Center for allowing us to hold this totally stimulating and incredibly inspiring conversation. Thank you so much. Please join us next Wednesday for Inayat Siddiqui co-hosting a webinar on civil resistance in India today. But with no further ado, I'd just like to thank our panelists again. This is an incredible source of knowledge and wisdom that will be available to people for a long time. And I will encourage everyone I know to tune in. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Mateo, Amaya.